Guys, we'll get started in just a little bit after noon. Hi, Lee Bailey.
Hey, lady.
Good to see you.
I made it.
You did. I love it.
I think this is the most I'm leaving the house is right now.
The most you're leaving the house?
Yeah, this is counting down. Yeah, I'm leaving for a meeting right now. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. We can count this as you
How's it
leaving
going?
the house. It's going really well. Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, okay. I haven't been in the office yet.
Lee, when are you ever in the office?
I know. I do need to visit that office I pay for every now and then.
You do. I agree. We miss you.
I just heard Sherry's back.
Sherry's back.
Yeah, I was like, I didn't see the big announcement on that one, but she's like, I kept it quiet.
Yeah, it's good to have her back.
No, we got her Rosie, so it's fine.
Many thanks. Lee, we'll get started here just a couple minutes after noon, okay? Okay, everyone, the dreaded 3 minutes of silence is now over. And we're gonna go ahead and get started. Welcome, thanks for coming to our monthly agent meeting. We are gonna start off with the lovely Kate Tuttle telling us about a neighborhood that I'm guessing some of us are familiar with. This is the office that our neighborhood is in, Herron Morton Place. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And Kate, you can go ahead and take it away. You're muted, Kate.
Now you can hear me.
There you go.
Hi, guys. How is everybody? Yes, so we are chatting about Herron Morton Place today. I know there are several of us agents who live in the neighborhood, and Platt is obviously in Herron Morton Place as well. So Rosie just put up the map that Sarah made of Herron Morton, and you can see the borders, north and south, 16th to 22nd, and then Penn to Central. A couple highlights in here of the businesses we have. So the Studio KG, that's at the corner of 22nd and New Jersey. That originally was the first barbershop owned by a female, an African-American female, in Herron Morton Place. So that's cool that it is actually still a place people can go. Couple other things that are kind of interesting. The governor let's see here. Governor of Indiana in the early 1900s, 1914 to 1918, lived at 21st and Delaware. Samuel Ralston was his name. A couple other fun facts about Herron Morton Place for those people who are interested in history. The HMP Park, so the park is a popular place in Herron Morton. It's also home to the Oktoberfest, which is a fun fall fundraiser that we do as a neighborhood. But that park used to be called Camp Morton, and it actually housed, it was a prison camp for Confederate soldiers, and at one point had 5,000 of them in that spot, which is kind of crazy to think about. So if you're ever there playing on the playground or there for Oktoberfest, you can see the monument that talks about that there. What else? The name Tinker Street, so 16th Street is also named Tinker Street, and that was from Elizabeth Tinker, who purchased part of Herron Morton in the early days. So Tinker Street was named after her, and then she married and her last name was Talbot. So that name is also, Talbot Street also comes from her as well, which also brings us to the Talbot Street Art Fair. So this is a national art festival, one of the biggest in the nation. This year, unfortunately, because of COVID, it did not take place. It's usually around the second weekend of June, so it would have just happened, and we also had beautiful weather, so it would have been great. Herron High School is also in HMP, and that is how we got Herron Morton as a name. So Camp Morton was from the Civil War, and then a couple of Herron art students later called the neighborhood Herron Morton Place, and that's actually how we have our name now, and they formed the first Herron Morton Place Association in the mid-70s. So let's see, any questions? We have, several agents that live in HMP. I would say if you have buyers looking in this area, I mean, it's just a great neighborhood. I feel like it's a really good mix of people. It's also changed drastically, I feel like, in the past 7 years since we've lived in HMP. Just to give you an idea, when we bought our lot in the 1700 block of New Jersey, we bought it for $22,000. And you can see, Rosie asked me to pull some facts of vacant lots now. So in the last year, of the 5 lots that have sold in the BLC, the max price there was $240, minimum was $100. The $240 was a lot on the Esplanade on New Jersey Street there. And as far as homes go, the minimum price was $140. That was actually a gut rehab that Jenny helped sell. And then the max was just over $1 million in the 1600 block of New Jersey. So tons of development going on in this neighborhood. Things have really, really changed in the last 7 years. I feel like as a buyer, it's definitely a fun place to look. It's great. I feel like for all ages. Yeah, we love it.
Kate, can you share how long have you lived in Herron Morton, and then what are some specific things that you love about it or love to do in Herron Morton?
Yeah, we bought our lot in 2013, and prior to that, we lived on Alabama Street in the Old North Side. So we bought a lot and built a duplex and lived there for several years in the 1700 block of New Jersey. And then we bought a house on Central and did a gut renovation on that. And we've been in that the last 2 years. So we've been in Herron Morton since 2013. We've had 2 additional kids since then as well. So we love going on bike rides, neighborhood walks, jumping on the cultural trail down Alabama. When we don't have kids, we love to go to Tinker Street. So I'm excited for that to be able to reopen. They did have takeout for a short period, which was fun because our kids actually got to eat Tinker Street food. The MLK pool is super close to us and great. It is not one of the few pools open this summer. So hopefully that will be back next year because that has a great, has 2 pools, a great toddler pool and a bigger one. The parks, we have tons of parks. Like we have Herron Morton Park. We have the Colts Park, like right at 21st and Central. We have the MLK Park. So tons of places to take your kiddos to go if you, don't have a playground in your backyard, which most of us don't. So
that's perfect. Kate, thanks so much for sharing. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, guys.
Okay, y'all. So we are here today to talk mutual releases because they've been all over the place these days. So we have a couple people here joining us to chat. We have Kris Glassburn, Ryan Stevens, and Lee Bailey to share about some of their mutual release experiences. So Kris, would you mind starting and just tell us about a recent mutual release situation that you've been in and give us the dirty details?
I am pretty famous for mutual releases. Rosie called me and was like, hey, I instantly thought of you, which made me feel so good about myself. But I'm actually in a current situation in which we went with the for sale by owner, and if anybody wants to deal with this, it's 737 East 22nd Street. His name is James, the duplex. It's uninhabitable. That's why we have to mutually release, because the appraiser said he can't appraise it. And so we're trying to mutually release from him, and it's been 7 weeks and he's holding our money hostage. So now we are getting the lawyers involved. How we went about it was basically letting him know, like, hey, we can't appraise this house. We're willing to do a hard money lender. And he said no. And I said, okay, we'll send over a mutual release. But because he doesn't have representation, I don't think he understands what a mutual release is. So I actually had to go meet up with him and explain it to him, but he still refused to sign it. So that was fun. Still going on currently. And then I had this question asked to me by my team the other day, like, why do I get so many mutual releases? And I have a lot of investors, and I think that although they do trust me, they are like, well, let's run the numbers. And it's usually on properties that have multiple offers. So they'll just submit offers right away, get the offer and win it. And then they'll do their due diligence because of how like quick the market is. So then they finally do their due diligence, and you can only rough estimate some of the renovation costs, but I can't get up in the attic and see if there's active knob and tube and all that such. And I usually tell them, like, you need to quote 11,000 because it's an old house and I can guarantee that it's probably has knob and tube in there. So factor that into your renovation costs. But they still don't, or they don't factor in a sewer or something like that. So there's quite a bit of times where investors will just jump on duplexes or any kind of opportunities like that. And then it'll end up being mutually released because of it. The best mutual release I had was we were past our due diligence time, and we were like, we want to mutually release. So we only had 14 days, and we were on like day 18. And then we were like, we got our quotes back from everyone. We want to mutually release. Like, it's way too much money compared to what we anticipated spending. So they said no, and then they threatened litigation because we wanted to keep our earnest money. And then they continued to threaten litigation. So I became a very nosy Nelly and tried to find something out about the deal that would be able to break it, so that at least if they kept their earnest money, we were fine with that. Yes, I'm usually always in an as-is situation when I mutually release. I haven't mutually released any other situation. But long story short, I found out that the agent was married to the realtor, or was married to the seller, and it was never disclosed to us. So I used the Code of Ethics guidelines, made me read the entire book of Code of Ethics for realtors to find that out. If they didn't disclose it to us, I could put her towards a violation. So I told her that, and instantly we got the mutual release signed and the money was good. So not throwing like realtors under the bus, but I was doing my due diligence for my client to find how I could get out of this deal without him losing a bunch of money. So,
Kris, as you've gone through these mutual releases, like, are there overarching like lessons that you've learned from them, or things that you would take away and use next time?
I'd like to say that I have, but I still continue to get mutual releases, but it's honestly just because would I like to blame it on the market? Potentially. It's just like when a duplex pops up for an investor, it's like gold if the numbers work out. So as much as I'll like try to overestimate everything for them or bring a GC in, there'll still be things that are hidden and found even on the inspection during their due diligence. So yeah, but I would say as much as I learned something, I haven't.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kris. Ryan, over to you. Would you mind sharing about your most recent mutual release story? Give us all the deets.
All right, yeah, I knew that's why I was called about this, because of my latest one. It's probably as ugly as they get. Mine was really, I think, set up by either an agent who didn't put proper expectations in front of their clients. Also, some emotional buyers that I believe their family talked them out of buying the house after they signed the purchase agreement. But basically, they did the inspection. It was a cash offer on a $500,000 house. We didn't even get an inspection response. I got about a 4-page text from the agent saying that they're just going to send over for a mutual release, and there was stuff that wasn't disclosed that were defects, which they weren't defects, and I can get into that information. But so that was pretty frustrating because we never even got an inspection response. It was just give us our money back. So that's when I kind of got Jess involved, and just said, hey, I think you need to talk to the managing broker because she doesn't even follow the proper protocol for a purchase agreement here at this point. So she, of course, reached out to the managing brokers and wasn't getting any response. And she kind of agreed it's because they probably couldn't add any value to the conversation at this point. It's kind of like, hey, our agent's not doing anything properly. So then she sent over an inspection response, and literally all it said was fix everything on the inspection report. It didn't itemize anything. It just was fix everything on page 1 to 98, but half of it was a summary section. The rest was the inspection. So, so she obviously didn't want to do paperwork from the beginning. So, she started bringing up attorneys, and I think the thing that I learned from my prior career that I use now is once somebody says they're using an attorney, I stop all verbal communication at that point. You want to have text, emails, if something would go to court, because if you talk to somebody on the phone, it's he said, she said, either person could say they're lying. So I kind of, once the first word of attorney came up, I stopped talking to her. I think the agent tried to call me twice and I didn't even answer the phone. It was text or email. That's all I was going to do. And I had a text from her that stated, even if your seller fixes everything wrong with this house, my people still aren't going to buy it, which probably wasn't very smart of her to put in a text. But so I typed up the longest inspection response I've ever typed up. I actually had to do addendums 1 and 2. I've never done 2 addendums to an inspection response, but my sellers were going to fix, I think it ended up being 42 items. And I think there was only probably actually 6 defects. I mean, it depends on what lawyer you talk to, right? But I think there's probably 6 defects and 35 maintenance items that they were willing to do. So they sent back again after we sent it over. They wanted mutual release. They wanted their money back again. So that's kind of when I think we finally got a managing broker on the other side to talk to Jess. I know he apologized for something. I don't know what exactly. But so then I kind of told the agent after they sent that, I said, look, we're going to try to meet you in the middle here because it was a $5,000 earnest money check. I said, we'll keep $2,500. You guys can keep $2,500. I think it's a happy medium. I did tell her, I said, if this does go to litigation, I said, you have to look at the negative on your client's side. They clearly don't want to buy this house. They could be forced to perform the contract and buy it. So I think this is a happy medium. And then they started throwing out all these, we're going to retain a lawyer, and if we don't have our money back by the time we paid for the retaining of the lawyer, I mean, they were throwing out some wild claims. They were going to have a judge that day when they retained the lawyer keep them from fixing anything. I mean, the stuff they were saying was just out of left field. So, I mean, I want to sell my seller's house. Obviously, it's back under contract again, but it was almost one of those circumstances I wish it would have went to court because I feel like all of the stuff was on our side. Their main contending point was, I don't know how much you guys know about pools, but the bottom drain of the pool had been sealed for safety reasons by the prior owner of the property. I used to own a pool for 5 years, so I thought I knew a lot. Now I know all the codes about a pool, but if your bottom drain doesn't exist, you have to have 2 skimmers, which this pool has. So their biggest contention was the bottom drain was sealed and that should have been disclosed. The pool was to code, so I don't think any judge or lawyer would say that's a defect at that point. But as I told my clients, we could get 10 lawyers involved here and get 8 different answers on some of these questions. So I don't know where it's going to go. But they were like, well, we want to sell our house. We're not the suing type. So they finally just gave up and gave them their money back, which was frustrating for me because I've kind of learned in my career now, sellers disclosures seem like they don't mean a whole lot. And now it seems like earnest money, it used to be you're never getting your earnest money back unless you close on the property. But if you want to throw a fit and say you're going to get lawyers, then you might get it back for reasons that really aren't justifiable. So it was frustrating. And, I always try to find positives in things that go wrong. And I can't say that I really have in this one. That's been the most frustrating part because I feel like I blame the buyers, but I really blame the agent more because I feel like, excuse me, she didn't really set proper expectations going in. I mean, I know when I'm dealing with buyers, I tell them, look, when you give this earnest money up, you're pretty much not going to get it back unless you buy the house. Now, I know there are certain circumstances where they can, but I don't really address that until you have to. I think they just thought, hey, we can put this offer in, and then if we decide we don't want the house, we just get our $5,000 back. That's what it seemed like, especially with the way that she was, kind of going about business, which wasn't how you're supposed to. So So yeah, that one wasn't fun because, you know, at the end of the day, my sellers on the next, you know, offer that we got, they're like, well, we want some insurances on this earnest money. And I said, you know, the contract protects you, but, you know, at the end of the day, if somebody says they're going to get a lawyer, you have to get a lawyer, and then you have to go to court, and it has to be litigation. But they wanted me to ask specific questions of the next agent, and the next agent was way more experienced than the last agent just by the sales that I can see that she's done. So I kept having to preface to her like, hey, I'm not questioning your competence, but I'm going to ask you some really like absurd questions just to give my clients some sort of reassurance that you have looked at the seller's disclosure. Because the prior agent, this house had termite damage before my clients bought it. That was on the seller's disclosure. The first agent asked me about that when she was going to the inspection. She hadn't even seen it until that point. So that kind of threw a red flag up right there that this agent didn't even look over a seller's disclosure with their clients before signing a contract, and they're finding it 8 days later. So yeah, I had to ask this agent, have you guys read the seller's disclosure? Did you see the termite stuff? Did you see that the bottom drain is now sealed? We decided to put that on the seller's disclosure, even though it's not a defect, just so that somebody couldn't use that to try to say that is a defect and get out of it like the last time. So yeah, it wasn't fun. I'm still a little bitter about it, to be honest with you, just because I feel like my seller should have kept that money. I mean, we were off the market for 3 weeks, and we supposedly had 2 other offers coming in when these people put their offer in, but it was a cash offer. So it's like, well, I mean, cash is king. We're going to take this. So you guys can submit backup offers, but if you've got a mortgage, you don't have a chance. So yeah, another thing, if you guys want to hear how humorous it was, the pool has a wood deck around it, no longer has a concrete deck. There's a concrete deck underneath that was replaced with a wood deck. Part of their inspection response, they wanted the entire wood deck ripped up and anything wrong with the concrete deck underneath that to be repaired. So I kept telling the agent, that's like going into a house with carpet and saying you think the laminate underneath is damaged, so you need to pull the carpet up and fix the laminate. I mean, it was just absurd, the 2 things that were their biggest contention. So I don't know. I think that's
Ryan,
it. It was pretty hairy.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. I hadn't even got to hear the full story yet. So that's a doozy.
Yeah.
I have a couple follow-up questions for you. One, you mentioned that she didn't even, or whatever, the other agent on the other side didn't send over an inspection response. Is that something that they are like required to do before a mutual release, or is it kind of common courtesy to send over an inspection response? Like, tell me how that works.
Yeah, I mean, the purchase agreement specifically states that, you know, any defect that you would find in an inspection, you have to give the seller an opportunity to repair that defect. So yeah, you have to send in an inspection response. So I mean, that's literally outlined in the purchase agreement. So that's kind of why it showed me that these buyers got cold feet before they ever even went into the inspection process. I think it was an elderly couple that was retired, and they're taking on 2 acres with a pool and a tennis court. I think they saw what they wanted, and then their family was like, what are you guys doing? You're not going to be able to take care of this. So usually I wouldn't say that, but I think because they didn't follow protocol, I think they kind of played their hand to us.
Yeah, and then can you talk a little bit about how you're kind of counseling your sellers through that? Because obviously, like, this is a situation where you feel really frustrated. I'm sure your sellers feel really frustrated. Like, what are you communicating to them?
Well, so, I mean, I kept telling them, you know, I would basically, you know, and they've seen the purchase agreement, but kind of define what defects are supposed to be on a property, what you would be required to fix. But I would tell them multiple times, you know, this is my opinion, but I'm not a lawyer. You would have to get a lawyer involved. And, you know, depending on whose side they're representing, there's probably some cases out there that have set precedents for certain things and not other things. So they understood that for the most part. And I apologized a couple times because I probably said to them 5 times over a week of conversations that, you know, but I'm not an attorney, so I don't know what an attorney is going to say. And I didn't want to like keep saying that to them, but I felt I needed to, just because I didn't want to give all of my opinion out and then not follow it up with that, because then they would be, not that they're the suing type, obviously, but I didn't want them to hold that against me after the fact. Not that I think they would, you never know though. So yeah, I just kept telling them, and I also too, I didn't want to whip them into a frenzy. So like some of the stuff that was being said to me on the other agent side, I didn't give them all of the details of like the absurdities of it, because I didn't want them to get more emotional from what was being said. So it was kind of like, they're saying they're going to get an attorney and pay a retaining fee. And that's pretty much about the only extent of this big long email I got of them getting a judge and jury involved in all this other crap that was coming out. I just kept it really simple on certain stuff like that, just to not make them more emotional than they already were.
Yeah, that's great. You have a question from Kate. Says, how long did it take to get under contract again?
It took 4 or 5 days. So fairly quickly, which it was kind of weird because we went back on the market and we had like 1 showing in 3 days. And then we had 4 showings the 4th day and like 3 offers on day 5 or 6 or whatever it was. So for some reason, I think it was June 5th was like the day this house caught on fire again, even though it'd been on the market 5 days. We all of a sudden just, we had somebody come from Evansville to look at the house. It was just really weird. But yeah, I think it's about 5 days before we accepted another offer. So
yeah, that's great. Ryan, thanks so much for sharing, and also sorry you had to go through that. Woof.
Oh, and one other fun thing about this, they took the survey location report out of the house during the inspection, and then they held it hostage, saying they wouldn't give it back to the sellers until they signed the mutual release, which is absurd. Like I had to tell the agent, that's the seller's property. It needs to be returned immediately. So just had to make another phone call or email about that, because they literally basically stole something from them and then held it hostage. So that was another interesting part of that transaction.
Jeez Louise. Yeah, that's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for sharing, Ryan.
Yes, ma'am.
Last but not least, we have Lee Bailey in the house, everyone. Lee, do you want to go ahead and share about a mutual release experience you have had?
Sure. I want to mention first to Kristen and Ryan that don't worry, Rosie's telling us all that we're really great at mutual releases, and I felt the exact same way as, my God, how many have I done? So you guys are great. Rosie, reword it.
I got this information from other people. I was trying to pose it as like,
oh yeah, I'm supposed to thank Mark Nottingham as well. Thank you. What I've heard a lot, I have a coronavirus one, a mutual release, basically along the lines of, you can tell why they backed out. We were under contract all the way through inspections, and coronavirus hit, and we got an inspection. I was like, we're going to correct everything. We know there's some things wrong with the house. It's older, and we didn't get a inspection response either. It's like, we just want a mutual release. And I'm like, but we're going to fix everything. And that's where I got, well, I'm like, we know what's happened here. They're first-time buyers. They backed out, and we know what this is about. But since you're not allowing us to even correct anything, we're going to have to take your earnest money. Well, you know, then I start getting from this agent, which was great. She was doing what she had to do. But my buyer's a nurse. And so she played everything she could, and I appreciated that. You know, don't take her money. She's working on corona patients. Well, I had my seller who had a small business. And I'm like, I trump you on that. My guys lose a small business because of corona. So we went back and forth playing emotions and stuff like that. And then my solution, because we could keep the money, is that we should split it simply because of corona. Now, was I representing my client the best way? Probably not. I could have kept it. But this is also, you know, a business. So I had to say, okay, nurse, you can have your money back, but we're going to keep half of it. So I thought that was the fairest way to go. I'm going to yell at you for what you did wrong, and then I'm going to, okay, here's a present. So that's just kind of the way I handled it recently. One thing that you guys touched on was the mutual leases when you've got a hot property or a property that had multiple offers, and then, you know, somebody wants to back out at the last minute because they are doing that grab and we'll do our due diligence later. Basically, what I'm seeing is that the mutual release will hold you hostage. Well, you can't take another offer if you're under contract still. So the mutual release then holds you up from moving your whole product along. So my thought is you really can save yourself some time if you're going to go into a mutual release like this, that you see where there's going to be an argument. If you've got a hot property, you might want to just save yourself time and jump off of it and on to the next one. I mean, mine had multiple offers each time, on the market forever, but for other reasons. So judge yourself or gauge yourself with that. I mean, I can fight these guys, or I can just simply mutual release it, knowing it's unfair, but I got to get this back on the market and get it sold. The more days it's off, the more the problems look, bigger. So there's my story.
Amazing. I love hearing from you. Any other parting words of wisdom or advice? You've been in the business for a while, know what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad I got on this. I had no idea there were so many of you dealing with the exact same crappy problems I'm dealing with. Thanks, Rosie.
Lee, this is what happens when you show up to brokerage meetings.
Who are all these people? I don't know who this is. That's all I got, Rosie.
That's perfect. Thanks, Lee. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Okay, guys, we are going to hand it over to Mark, and he's going to walk through just some of the technical details of what you need to know about mutual releases. Mark, over to you.
Good stuff. Thanks to the three of you that shared. Nobody wants to be good at mutual releases, but they are a reality in our business. I'm going to share a couple just high-level thoughts before I share how mutual releases happen and how you process them here at the brokerage. One thing I think to keep in mind is, and Ryan referenced this, the frequency that a buyer or a seller or their agent throws in the possibility of going to court. It happens, that verbiage happens all the time. So clearly, anytime a deal starts to get really tenuous, somebody's emotions are going to be high. And in a lot of cases, at least four parties' emotions, including yours, are going to be high. And so people are going to tend to say things all of a sudden gets aggressive, it gets threatening. And at the end of the day, there's only two ways that a deal can release. One is the buyer and the seller sign the same document to agree on the terms of the release, or a judge makes that determination. And what I think people maybe don't have a frame of reference for is that there's this perception that deals just go to court. And it's really not true. We as a brokerage are approaching having done 3,000 transactions. Okay, inception to date. We'll do probably 1,500 transactions this year as a brokerage. And in 3,000 transactions, I always afraid I'm going to jinx this when I say something like this. Our brokerage has yet to have a transaction go to court, ever. I will joke with people that I have actually gone to court as a seller. I've gone to small claims court as a seller because I was kind of willing to just let the thing be a pain in the ass. And I wasn't representing myself. It was on a property that's not in Indianapolis. I had a different broker, but I kind of wanted to see what it was like because I'd rather not go as broker. So I was okay going as seller. But I just think that's important to keep in mind, that as the kind of that threat level rises, keeping in the back of your mind, not that it's impossible to go to court, but that the 99.9% of the time, what's going to end up happening is that the buyer and the seller will come to terms, and both of them are going to be really mad about it. And they're going to sign the release. And that doesn't mean it's easy or that it's not a big deal. They're big deals, but I think just frame of reference to know that the emotion tends to kind of ramp up, and then people realize, oh, right, we're talking about a couple $1,000s. and hardly anyone is willing to spend the time and money. I mean, the deal that I went to court on as seller, I won, but lost. Like I won the court case and spent more money on my attorney than I retained in earnest money. Matter of fact, twice as much. So people come to that realization, like there's nobody wins if this goes to court. So that's number one. Number two, Rosie, can you let me share my screen? Maybe you've already done that.
Already done it. Go for it.
Cool. I'm going to pull up a mutual release here. Okay, so IAR mutual release. Y'all unfortunately seen too many of these. It's a pretty simple document. It's got all the parties in the transaction, buyer, seller, list agent, selling agent. They've agreed to release this contract, which some of the language here means that both parties are released from any obligations that they have in the purchase agreement. And what this always comes down to is right here. What's going to happen with the earnest money? And in some cases, further damages. So Ryan referenced this, right? In theory, it is possible that a judge would force a buyer or a seller to perform. So there's sometimes conversation about like, hey, rather than trying to force you to perform, we're going to retain the earnest money and you have to pay us damages. So you can pursue that. But generally, if a mutual release happens, it's just going to be about the earnest money, returned to buyers, paid to seller. Other could be something like there was no earnest money deposited, or it's going to be split 50-50, or the earnest money is paid to the seller and the buyer agrees to compensate the seller $1,000 in damages or something along those lines. So the process, paperwork wise, for the release is fairly straightforward. I'm going to stop my share. Steve, I'm going to come back to that. That's a good question. So as a brokerage, the process to finalize that deal, this is assuming assuming we're on either side, but assuming we're on the listing side and we're holding the earnest money, it's in our escrow account. You complete that mutual release, you open up a .loop folder, upload it, submit the folder for review. Michelle double checks the document and sends it along to Ashley to release the earnest money. But we can't release earnest money. There's only two ways as a brokerage we can release earnest money. I'm going to come back to the other one. But again, 99 times out of 100, when we're releasing earnest money, it's because you upload that mutual release signed by everyone. Okay. So the buyer and the seller are the decision makers, not the brokers, right? Our opinion has no binding on what happens with the earnest money. We just have to look at that document. And if it's signed by both parties, then we're okay to release it to either the buyer or the seller or some combination. And we just need the addresses that they would prefer to have it sent to. Unfortunately, some of you know this process very well. Some of you haven't had to do it yet. So
real quick, yeah, Ashley let me know, and I've included this as part of our process, that we need the listing contract as well when you submit that mutual release form. So just keep that in mind. Thanks,
Michelle. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Steve asked a good question there. In Indiana, has anyone ever successfully executed a failure to perform? Meaning, Steve, what you mean there is that a judge forced a party to perform? Yeah. I don't know of that happening. I would guess that in a residential transaction at some point in time, yes, that has happened. But here's what I can say. On the commercial side of our business, forced performance is much more likely, right? If I'll just pick on Walmart because they're pretty easy to pick on. If Walmart has an agreement to buy or lease some real estate, and then they try to get out of that deal without cause, decent chance that the other party in that deal could force Walmart to perform. That a judge will say, you have this contract, we're going to force you to perform on that contract. On the residential side, it is very, very rare that a judge would force a party to buy or sell a house. What is much more likely, if it got in front of a judge, is that a judge would agree to damages to one party or the other. There's a variety of things that can get included in damages. I don't want to pretend to be an attorney, but unfortunately I have had to engage in this fairly often. Usually it's going to be a combination of the earnest money involved, actual expenditures, right? If a buyer has paid for an inspection, they've paid for an appraisal, they hired a moving company, they're now going to have to rent an apartment for 60 days to find a house. Like, they can pile these things on that if a seller fails to perform, a buyer can oftentimes get those damages. But again, it very rarely goes to court. Even when attorneys get involved, each position might be, or each party might have an attorney draft a letter that states their position before they can agree on a mutual release. But then they all start doing the math about what it's going to cost to go to court. And a seller may actually agree to pay some damages to the buyer. So I think that's a part of why performance doesn't happen. I mean, I think you're right. Is it an empty threat? I mean, someone could certainly pursue it. They have a right to pursue performance. Do I think it's very likely? No, not on a residential deal. Maybe an investor. I mean, there could be a situation where it's kind of a commercial deal. Both parties were investment oriented, but a private homeowner or buyer, just not very likely. Kate, Jess and I and a couple agents here at Platt had two very interesting mutual release debates going on at the same time a couple weeks ago, and I'll reference that. Something I mentioned earlier about the decision of earnest money. One thing that can happen if the two parties are not able to come to an agreement on earnest money, again, a judge is beside the buyer and the seller. A judge is the only other person who can dictate where earnest money will go. But there are very rare, but they do happen. There are occasions where, as a brokerage, we send what's called a 60-day notice letter. So some of you may have had this happen. So if we're holding the earnest money and the buyer and the seller can't agree on the deal, and let's say the deal's already expired, right? We're talking the closing date on the purchase agreement was 3 weeks ago. Everybody understands, like, this deal isn't going to happen. But there actually hasn't been an executed mutual release because they can't agree on what's going to happen with the earnest money. As a brokerage, we do have the right to send a letter, certified mail, to all the parties involved. The law is that we have to send the letter to our last known address of the parties. Interesting case study for you in a second. That says, in 60 days, here's what we're going to do with the earnest money unless someone takes this to court. So it's to prevent us from having to hold earnest money forever. So we do have the right to send that letter. In most cases, the listing brokerage is going to send the letter and say that they're going to release the earnest money to the seller in 60 days, unless the buyer files to go to small claims court. Well, in Indiana, it's $6,000 or less to small claims court. So most of the time, an earnest money dispute is small claims court. We, just to give you a frame of reference, I think in almost 3,000 deals, we have probably sent the 60-day letter 4 or 5 times, maybe not even that many. Again, that's fairly rare because eventually the parties realize We're not going to be happy about this, but the path of least resistance is to just come to an agreement. Okay. Kate's question, I think, is one of the more important about when you're in the middle of something that's about to be a mutual release. It's really kind of important for both sides, which is when can the seller remarket the property? When do they have the ability to sell the home to someone else? It matters to the buyer because that can be the buyer's leverage. Hey, let me out of this deal so you can get back on the market, like Lee was talking about, right? And then obviously it matters to the seller because if a buyer is kind of holding them hostage, Ryan, I think you were talking about this, right? The buyers probably kind of know that the seller just wants to get the house back on the market and sold. And so I'm going to be honest, I don't like the way that our state law does this. Nobody asked me, but I think there's a problem with how this typically plays out. So assuming the purchase agreement hasn't expired. So scenario number one is that the closing date on the purchase agreement has not passed yet. And most of the time when you're debating about this, you're still under contract, right? That hasn't expired. A seller it would not be a good idea for a seller to sell the home to someone else without an executed mutual release. And I think that law should be different. I really do, as does, by the way, the real estate attorney that represents our brokerage, who we've worked with the most. He takes a different perspective on this. So there is some debate on, because Kate, the issue at hand is if a buyer has made very, very clear that they're not going to perform, they have abandoned the contract. Indiana contract law, not just real estate contract law, but Indiana contract law says, I'm just going to use John and Ryan. If Ryan's the seller and John's the buyer, if John makes very clear that he doesn't tend to execute the contract, he can't then later try to enforce that contract on Ryan. He can't have it both ways. Now, you really get into a gray area there about what is very clear that he intends to abandon. Is it sending a mutual release? Is it texting saying we're not buying the house? I mean, like, that's where this gets sticky. IAR's position is, as a broker, you should not advise or really even allow your seller to sell the home twice, even if buyer number one has made it very clear that they're not going to buy it. So if the purchase agreement has expired, you're past your closing date and the buyer didn't perform, you're clear. Back on the market, you can sell it to whoever you want because the buyer now definitely loses their right. That deal is no longer binding because it's expired. You're just going to debate about earnest money. But if that closing date hasn't passed yet, IAR, I think, takes the conservative position, which is, as a seller, you definitely need to sign mutual release. And so we had a situation a couple weeks ago as a brokerage. We had a couple of these pretty interesting ones. One where a seller got a backup offer that was $10,000 higher than the one that they were under contract with, and they had some inspection problems. So the buyer submitted an inspection response. The seller sent seller inspection response number one, and the buyer rejected seller inspection response number one. And so the seller wanted to cancel the deal, right? Hey, I told them what I would do to address the defects, and they said they wouldn't accept that. And I've got this backup offer for 10 grand. But the buyer still has to sign that mutual release. In that case, the buyer actually ended up agreeing to buy the house as is. So there was never a mutual release. So the buyer took a deal that was worse than a deal that they could have taken 2 days earlier. So kind of fascinating. The other one was a situation where the buyer had not even yet delivered earnest money. And like kind of next morning, maybe buyer remorse communicated, hey, we're not going to buy this house. And we know you had multiple offers. the buyer actually even said, the buyer's agent said, hey, we know you had multiple offers. We wanted to let you know right away so that you could go to one of your other offers. You should go ahead and do that right now. And they were debating about earnest money and damages. So it can get really messy. I would just say, if in doubt, involve Jess and me. But the conservative, safe advice is you cannot sell the house again until there is a signed mutual release or the purchase agreement has expired. So there's some debate about that, but I think that's like pretty good rule of thumb to go by. And I think you'd have to have like maybe kind of the perfect storm of circumstances to try another strategy. But I think there would be some situations where you might. Hopefully I'll never be in those. There was one other thing. What was the other? Oh, yeah. We had one, this is, I mean, it's just like real estate. Sorry for it's like real estate shit show 101. We had one last year. We were representing the buyer, our client, on their earnest money check had an address from Seattle, Washington that she had not lived in for something like 7 years. She had a 7-year-old address on her checks. She submitted the earnest money check with that address. We had a debate about the earnest money, the release, it fell apart. I personally think our buyer was correct. But she wasn't willing to take it to court, but wouldn't sign the mutual release. And the listing brokerage sent the 60-day letter to her Seattle address that was 6 years outdated. The law does not require that they guarantee receipt or verify receipt. It doesn't require that they send it to us. We didn't find out the 60-day letter had been sent until the 60 days was gone and they had already released the earnest money. So what's interesting about that is that the buyer still didn't lose her right to take it to court. So the broker, when we send that 60-day letter, if we then release the earnest money to the seller, the buyer could still take the seller to small claims court. So our letter doesn't finalize the penalty. It just lets us get the earnest money out of our escrow account. That's really all it does. The buyer could still pursue the seller. Those things are super rare. For the frequency that they come up in conversation, they hardly ever happen. So as the mutual release gets signed. It's a fun topic. I was going to say two other things I had jotted down. I think Ryan made a really good point. When you sense this coming, I think it's really good practice to communicate in email or text as much as possible. I think Ryan's absolutely right there. Though I might give one exception to that. If you're in a scenario where your client isn't ready to commit to splitting earnest money, I could see a situation where you might say, I'm not going to send an email that suggests splitting earnest money because my client isn't ready to do that. But I might call the other agent to say, hey, my client hasn't said they'll do this yet. Yours hasn't either. But can we try to work on this and get each of our clients to agree to split the earnest money? What do you think your client would say? I mean, something like that. But outside of that, I think trying to keep it in writing is good practice. The other thing I was going to say, there are some other parts in the process where mutual releases can happen, but it's almost always inspections. And Kris referenced this. I think, Ryan, you referenced this as well. Under a normal purchase agreement, the buyer does not have the right to pursue a mutual release immediately after an inspection, right? The purchase agreement is very clear that the buyer has to give the seller an opportunity to address material defects to the buyer's reasonable satisfaction. Well, that's where this debate always comes about. what meets the definition of material defect, and what's reasonable satisfaction to the buyer. So if they can't come to terms on that, then you're looking at a release. But the buyer, if you are a buyer's agent and you send a mutual release immediately with an inspection report with no response, that is a mistake. Ryan is right. The other agent in that deal made a mistake in doing that. They're violating the terms of the contract to not give the seller the opportunity to address the defects. What's really interesting about the as-is addendum, which by the way, as of like 2 years ago, that was like never used. It's become much more common now. What I like about the as-is addendum, so this is, guys, it's counterintuitive. I think most people assume an as-is addendum is to the favor of the seller, right? There's some common agreement that an as-is addendum is like a way to make the offer more attractive because it's the buyer stating an intent not to ask the seller to address defects. An as-is addendum is actually to the buyer's advantage. And it surprises me that our market hasn't picked up on that totally, but an as-is addendum removes the requirement for a buyer to give the seller the right to address the defect. The as-is addendum is very clear, unless you change the wording. It says the buyer can get an inspection, and if they find anything they don't like, they can terminate the deal. Much clearer. You don't have to go through what is reasonable satisfaction. Is it reasonable to ask the seller to rip up a deck and fix the concrete under a deck? An as-is addendum just gives the buyer the right to say, no, I'm out. I think it can be useful in stating an intent. Like you can kind of sell a seller on the idea of like, look, my buyer's going to be low maintenance. They're not going to ask you for repairs. They just want to get an inspection so they know what they're buying. But the document itself gives the buyer a lot of leverage because they can cancel the deal. Is it unilaterally? Yes. They could cancel the deal unilaterally without any participation from the seller. Yeah, I mean, Ryan, I think you're right. I think there would be situations where a house is just going to get lit up on an inspection response and everybody's trying to avoid the long renegotiation and kind of nitpicky response. So you can try the as-is, and I think it's a good tool for that, but it still gives the buyer a lot of leverage to do an inspection. The first as-is deal that I did was probably, 3 or 4 years ago. The buyers got an inspection and said, okay, we're going to walk, but if the seller wants to drop the price by 10 grand, we'll stick around. And this was before they were pretty common. And as you could imagine, the seller was livid about that because they kind of misunderstood what the as-is addendum was. They thought the buyer waived their right to an inspection, which is very different. This is fun topic.
Mark, you have one question from Trisha in the chat too, if you want to check that
sorry,
out.
Trisha, I missed it. Yes. Yeah, so Trisha's asking if you're still within the period of time that the as-is addendum gives you the right to inspect the property. Yeah, you can just send the mutual release. Reference the line in the as-is addendum and buyer return earnest money. Now, in that scenario, a seller still has to sign the mutual release and agree to release the earnest money. But you have a lot of leverage to get them to do so because the documents are very clear that if this got in front of a judge would say, well, this document gives the buyer the right to do that. No one can force the seller to release the earnest money other than the judge. But usually when it's that clear, a couple days later, the seller says, okay, fine, and signs it.
So can I throw in other question on that? Like if your buyer hasn't done an inspection and you're in an as-is and they're like I had an interesting one that it totally got resolved, but you know, and honestly, how my client felt about it was very much with a lot of, like, it was like one of those very unusual circumstances where you're in a mutual release, but both sides are actually acting extremely graciously towards each other. It was really strange. It was lovely, but odd. In that we got into a contract on a house that they loved, and then immediately, like, this is of course in May, like immediately they have extended family members who get hit with a lot of economic circumstances of COVID, and they all of a sudden are like, oh my God, if we buy this house, we are in no position to help any of our family out. Like, they just did a flip flop, and these are experienced home buyers. Like, they knew that was not part of the contract. It was not a contingency. It was not anything. And they've bought and sold multiple properties, and they basically like just had kind of their whole external world shifted that had nothing to do with the deal. They could have still qualified for the loan. That there was nothing wrong with the house, like nothing. And they were like, we have to back out. Like, we have to be present for our family on every front at this point. We can't do this deal. And we feel really bad for the sellers. This is not what we intended. They can keep the earnest money. Like, that's what they said. But technically it was an as-is deal. And I was like, okay, I can either fight this around in a lot of strange ways, or I can just take this to the other side and say, look, this is what my clients are saying. This is what's going on with them. You know, this was not their intention. They feel bad for the seller. They love the house. They'd love to be moving forward. This is just the shit show of 2020. And basically send a mutual release offering the seller all of the money, saying they just need to back out, and they don't feel comfortable arguing about it because they understand this is not part of their contract. And then I didn't hear anything back. And then the realtor, I sent her a text on an evening, like a couple days after, and, you know, and she said, can I call you tomorrow? And I started having this rising, like, oh God, they're going to like litigate, like what's going to happen? And I was like, if I've learned anything over the past like month or so, this is something I can't do anything about. Today is over. I'm going to bed. It was like 8:30. I was like, I'm done with today. I'm going to sleep because that'll make tomorrow happen. And as long as tomorrow's coming, I'm all good. Woke up the next morning, the realtor called me, and her mom had died the day before I had sent her the text. So I'm very glad that I did not all of a sudden give her a bunch of attitude about not responding, because the woman had just lost her mother. And the seller had gotten back to her and said, you know what, this circumstance is strange. I appreciate the buyers being so generous. I think it's only fair that we share the earnest money, and we're going to return half of it. Now by contract, I look at it and I go, well, it was my client's, because we had an as-is addendum. And in that case, I could have become argumentative about it, but I think part of my job is to represent how my clients feel as well as their interests, and those two things frequently overlap. So like, it's looking at their money, but I'm also like their experience, they know I can argue for it. So it was just an interesting situation, but definitely like a reminder for me in de-escalation, because I've definitely been in other circumstances where that night I would have been like on the phone being like, what is going on? Why haven't I gotten an answer? Like just being really pushy. And it was like everybody in the situation kind of left with like, okay, like we don't control 2020, whatever. Here we go. So, but I don't, you know, but in that circumstance, it sounds like I could have just been like, yeah, as is addendum, we're out of here. We want the earnest money back.
Most likely, yes. I'm going to pull up the as-is addendum here in a moment. But I think you make an important point. It is our job to pursue our clients' interests, but it is not our job to pursue something that we think is in our clients' interest that they don't. Right? So if they think, hey, I just want this to be done. I know I'm probably due the $1,000 or whatever, but I would rather it be done. Or given the circumstances that the other party has, I'd rather not have the $1,000. Then I think that's what we have to deem to be in their interest, and we pursue that strategy. So it's not always going according to the contract. If your client's willing, for whatever reason, to kind of cede on that point, I'm gonna share real quick and pull up the as-is addendum. Tricia, this answers your other question. So this is, y'all can see that section I have highlighted. So the buyer, to get the earnest money back in an as-is addendum, the buyer does have to perform an inspection. So buyer shall order all independent inspections. If buyer's inspections uncover any previously undisclosed defects, buyer shall have, X days to terminate the purchase agreement and get their earnest money back. Notice that that doesn't say licensed home inspector. It says independent inspections. I think most people probably read that to be licensed home inspector, but say you had a licensed general contractor or a builder or an architect or an engineer. I think if it's some form of independent inspection, whether paid for or not, something other than the buyer themselves, then I think you meet the definition of what's in point 3 there, and could expect to exit the deal right then. Most of the time that's going to be a home inspector, but I don't think that language requires it to be a home inspector. I think it just has to be someone else that a reasonable argument could say is qualified to evaluate something. Yeah, Lee, good question from Lee. We'll finish with this one. Material defects. The definition of material defect is clear. It's the application of the definition that gets so gray area. So it's something that affects the livability, safety, or value of the house. Well, then all of a sudden you get into a debate about, y'all have run into this, the 20-year-old furnace that's still running, or 27-year-old furnace that's still running. Is the fact that it's 27-year-old a material defect? Well, you're going to have people debate about that. Is the lack of a handrail on a 2-stair entry to a porch? I mean, the list obviously gets pretty long about what buyers and sellers can end up arguing about. Yeah, right. The thermal seal of the window's still working just fine. It just doesn't look very good. I mean, there are some things that are clearly not material defects. A wall that is beat up, a paint on a wall that's beat up. The buyer saw it beforehand. That's probably not a material defect. Then there's some things that are very clearly material defects. The furnace won't turn on. The roof is leaking. But then there's this massive list of things that buyers and sellers can disagree on because it's a subjective definition. Sometimes I wish that we did, so like Illinois, for example, like well, I guess I don't know about the entire state, but the Chicago marketplace, the inspection process is very favorable to the buyer. Seller does not get the right necessarily to address the defects. The buyer just has a due diligence period. There's an escrow period, is what they call it. They get the inspection and they decide to move forward or not. More deals fall apart. But I think the job of a realtor is easier in that scenario, because it's more of a like, okay, do you want to buy it? Yes, great. No, okay, we'll go find another one. Like, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but I do kind of wish we did it like that, so we weren't debating about material defect quite as much. But thanks for joining, everybody. It's not a fun topic. I think it's a healthy topic to talk about so that you don't feel like why am I the only one having a mutual release? Now you know that Lee is an expert at them and you could reach out to Lee. Yes. But we'll wrap up with that. I love you, Lee.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, guys.